One click, one subscribe, and you become part of a story bigger than any of us. A soldier's grave, weapons at the hip, a curved blade built for close combat, the kind carried only by men trained to fight, not farm. Beside him, fragments of a standard, the wolf-headed dragon banner that once terrified Roman legions on a northern frontier. Every object in that grave says one thing: this man belonged to the fiercest warrior culture the Carpathian Mountains ever produced. The bones told a different story. When researchers extracted DNA from his teeth, the part of a skeleton most likely to survive 2,000 years intact, the genetic signature didn't match the identity buried with him. Not close. His ancestry pointed toward the Mediterranean, toward North Africa, toward populations that, on paper, had no business standing under that banner at all. And he wasn't alone. The same pattern turned up in grave after grave, across one of the largest cemeteries ever recovered from this frontier. 34 individuals in total, each one a small contradiction waiting to be noticed. So here's the question worth sitting with before anything else. If this warrior was buried with the sacred Draco standard of a free Dacian fighter, why does his own DNA trace back to Anatolia and North Africa? To understand how strange that answer really is, you have to understand the story historians have told about these warriors for 2,000 years, because that's the story about to fall apart. The Dacians were not a footnote people. They were a Thracian-speaking, Indo-European population who controlled a vast stretch of territory from the Danube River up into the Carpathian Mountains, land that today covers Romania, Moldova, and pieces of Bulgaria, Serbia, and Ukraine. The Greeks called them the Getae. The Romans called them Dacians. Either name, the reputation was the same: warriors who fought under a wolf-headed dragon standard, a battle flag designed to howl in the wind as it moved, terrifying enemy formations before a single sword was drawn. Their spiritual world was just as distinctive. At its center stood Zalmoxis, a god-teacher figure tied to a belief in the immortality of the soul, a belief later Greek writers claimed made Dacian warriors reckless in battle, unafraid of death because death, to them, wasn't an ending. Modern historians treat that specific claim with caution. It comes filtered through Greek observers writing about a culture not their own. But the social structure underneath it is better documented. Dacian society split cleanly along class lines, an upper class known as the Paliadi, marked by brimless Scythian-style felt hats, and a peasant class who went bareheaded, wearing their hair long. Then came Rome. Between 101 and 106 CE, the Emperor Trajan launched two brutal campaigns into Dacian territory. King Decebalus resisted as long as any ancient ruler resisted Rome, and lost. By 106 CE, Dacia was a Roman province, and the free warrior kingdom that had produced 2 centuries of resistance was gone. What survived, according to the standard modern narrative, was the bloodline. Ask most Romanians today where their ancestry begins, and you'll hear some version of the same claim. A continuous genetic and cultural thread running from those Dacian warriors straight down to the present day. It's a point of real national pride, and it isn't built purely on nostalgia. Modern Romanian still carries an estimated 160 words argued to descend from the old Dacian-Thracian substrate. Words like balaur, meaning dragon, and branza, meaning cheese. Popular accounts point to genetic studies from 2022 claiming direct maternal and paternal line continuity between ancient Ghetto Dacians and modern Romanians, though it's worth being upfront that those specific claims haven't been confirmed through a clearly identifiable peer-reviewed source, so they belong in the category of widely repeated rather than fully verified. Here's what almost nobody mentions when they tell that continuity story. It rests on remarkably little direct genetic evidence from the warriors themselves. Not the peasants, not the general population. The actual fighting class, the men and women buried with weapons and battle standards, had barely been genetically tested at all. That gap, a national origin story resting on almost no hard genetic data from actual warriors, is exactly where the real anomaly was hiding. In 2026, that gap finally started closing. A paleogenomics team published a preprint titled "On the Edge of Empire: Paleogenomic Insights into Roman Dacia," posted to the research server bioRxiv that April. The exact lead author and home institution behind the work aren't fully confirmed in public reporting yet, so we'll refer to them simply as an international research team. But the scale and seriousness of the project aren't in question. Their subject, the Apulum Dialul Fursalor necropolis, outside modern Alba Iulia, Romania, one of the largest funerary complexes ever recovered from Roman Dacia, sitting at what was once the most populous urban center in the entire province. The team recovered genome-wide data. Think of it as reading the full instruction manual of a person's ancestry, not just a single chapter, from 34 individuals. They screened teeth specifically, because dental enamel protects genetic material far better than bone across 1900 years of decay. What they found didn't match the tidy continuity picture at all. Instead of a genetically uniform warrior population, the necropolis showed pronounced heterogeneity, real, measurable diversity where the consensus story predicted sameness. Here is where it gets complicated. The diversity wasn't random. It split cleanly along sex lines. Female individuals showed strong genetic affinities to Eastern European, steppe, and Caucasus-linked populations, closely tied to Bronze Age and Iron Age groups from Moldova, southern Russia, and the Armenian highlands. Male individuals showed the opposite pattern entirely. Closer genetic ties to Mediterranean and North African populations, including groups linked to Roman and Punic, Carthaginian-descended backgrounds. Not invaders replacing locals, not locals replacing invaders. A split down the middle, by sex, running straight through a population that was supposed to be one people with one bloodline. Clean story, gone. That single sex-biased pattern means the pure native warrior bloodline this entire continuity narrative depends on was never one bloodline to begin with. Not a hybrid created by Rome, not a corruption of an earlier pure stock, but a fundamentally split genetic picture sitting underneath a single, unified cultural and military identity. Researchers are careful to frame this as a documented pattern in the data, not a fully resolved explanation for why it exists. The what is clear, the why is still being argued. And this wasn't some fringe DNA hobbyist project pulling headlines from a shaky sample. The work was funded through recognized NIH NIGS grant channels, cited directly in the preprint under grant number R35GM142939. The kind of institutional backing that signals serious, peer-scrutinized genomic science, not a weekend ancestry experiment. So the anomaly comes down to one uncomfortable question. If the men buried in these warrior graves carry Mediterranean and Levantine ancestry, genetic roots stretching toward Italy, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean, who, exactly, is the Dacian warrior that an entire national origin story has been built around? The first theory says the answer is almost boring in its simplicity. Rome conquered Dacia in 16 CE. Empires move people. Soldiers, veterans, administrators, merchants, and enslaved individuals flowed into every new province. Anatolian was no ordinary provincial town. It grew into a wealthy municipium nicknamed Chrysopolis, the city of gold, built on Dacia's legendary gold-rich frontier economy. Gold draws migrants. Migrants leave DNA. Under this theory, the Mediterranean and North African signal in male remains is simply what you'd expect a few generations after conquest, once soldiers and traders from across the empire had settled, married, and been buried in provincial ground. The Y chromosome evidence, the genetic thread passed almost unchanged from father to son, like a surname written in biology instead of ink, supports this reading well. Lineages recovered from Apulim's male burials trace broadly across the Mediterranean basin, the Near East, and even the Eurasian steppe, precisely the mixed population you'd expect from a multi-ethnic Roman garrison town, not a single ethnic fighting force. It's a clean chain of logic. Rome conquers in 16 CE. An empire-wide population influx follows. Within a few generations, the graveyard simply reflects imperial demographics rather than any older local bloodline. But that clean logic has a hole in it, and it's not a small one. This entire explanation assumes every individual analyzed from these warrior graves was buried after the conquest, inside the Roman provincial period, not before it. It says nothing about whether this level of genetic mixing already existed in the free Dacian kingdom, among the actual warriors who fought Trajan's legions and lost. It answers a question about Roman-era demographics while quietly stepping around the harder question the very first grave in this story raised. That's the safe, official answer. Rome mixed the population, end of story. But the female data from that same graveyard tells a very different, much older story about who was already mixing genes on this frontier long before a single Roman legionary ever set foot north of the Danube. That older story starts with the women, and it reaches back much further than anyone expected. The second theory says the steppe and Caucasus signature, carried by female individuals in these graves, isn't a Roman-era development at all. It's older, far older. Genetic comparisons tie that ancestry to late Bronze Age and Iron Age populations already established in Moldova, southern Russia, and the Armenian highlands, populations that had no connection to Rome because Rome hadn't arrived yet. which means the native pre-Roman Dacian gene pool wasn't a sealed, isolated bloodline waiting patiently in the mountains for Trajan to show up. It was already a steppe Carpathian blend, shaped over centuries by contact with Scythian and Sarmatian nomads, horse-riding peoples who moved through this region bringing cavalry warfare, new metalworking techniques, and long trade corridors stretching toward the Black Sea and beyond. Archaeologists date this contact zone to centuries before the 106 CE annexation. Centuries, not a generation, not a single war, a long, slow genetic layering that had already happened before the free Dacian kingdom reached its cultural peak. And that's where Theory 1 quietly falls apart. If the steppe Carpathian blend among Dacian women predates Rome by centuries, then Rome's Mediterranean-descended male migrants weren't the first wave of mixing on this frontier. They were the second. The bloodline this whole video keeps circling back to. The one grave goods, national pride, and popular DNA claims all assume was pure at some point in the past, was compound before the empire ever crossed the Danube. There is no clean baseline to return to. No untouched starting point where real Dacian warriors carried one unified ancestry. The mixing didn't start with conquest. Conquest just added another layer onto mixing that was already generations deep. Researchers are careful here, and it's worth being just as careful repeating it. The Apulum Dialul Fursalor sample is Roman period, meaning every one of the 34 individuals studied was buried after 106 CE. Nobody has yet produced confirmed genome-wide data from securely dated, pre-conquest, Free Kingdom-era Dacian warrior burials, the actual men who fought and lost against Trajan. So this theory reaches backward from continuity patterns in the wider region rather than testing Kingdom-era warriors directly. It's a strong inference. It is not, yet, direct proof. So if neither the men nor the women in these warrior graves were ever genetically pure, there's a third, darker possibility historians are far less comfortable saying out loud. The third theory doesn't ask where the ancestry came from. It asks whether ancestry was ever really the point. Here's the uncomfortable version, the Dacian warrior identity, the weapons, the Draco standard, the burial rites that mark a grave as belonging to the fighting class, may never have been a bloodline at all. It may have been a role, a fighting caste, a garrison identity, something closer to a job passed down and inherited than a bloodline passed down and inherited. And if that's true, that role could absorb genetically unrelated recruits. Men from the Italian peninsula, from the western Mediterranean islands, from Punic cities in North Africa, from communities scattered across the Levant. And hand every one of them the same symbols of belonging. The Y chromosome data supports this reading uncomfortably well. Male lineages recovered from these graves don't cluster into one tight regional signature. They spread across the Mediterranean basin, the Near East, North Africa, the Levant. A spread simply too wide to represent a single ethnic warrior lineage passing quietly from father to son across generations. Here is where it gets complicated in a different way than before. This reading suggests that grave goods, the weapons, the standard, the burial rites themselves, were passed down as an inherited institution, potentially independent of who was actually buried underneath them. That's not a claim the study's authors make outright. It's an interpretive leap, and a contested one, sitting right at the edge of what the genetic data can actually prove. But if it holds even partially, it means some of the most iconically Dacian warrior burials on record may belong to men with no ancestral tie to the Dacian people at all, only to the institution they served. No burial-by-burial confirmation exists to settle this. Researchers cannot currently look at one specific grave and say with certainty, foreign recruit, or steppe-descended local, or multi-generational mixed family. The theory stays exactly what it is, a live, contested possibility, not a verdict. To understand how something like this could even happen, you have to stand where these bones were actually found. Picture the ground at Apulum Dialul Fursalor, on the banks of the Mureș River, the old Roman legionary fortress walls still visible from the burial ground. This was Roman Dacia's beating heart in the 2nd century CE. Not a quiet frontier outpost, but one of the busiest crossroads in the entire province. Gold caravans arrived regularly from the mines at Alburnus Maior, hauling wealth that gave nearby Apulum I its nickname, Chrysopolis, the city of gold. In the marketplace, Latin mixed with Greek, with local Thracian dialects, with the trading speech of Punic merchants who'd followed commerce networks all the way from North Africa. Soldiers rotated in from garrisons scattered across the Mediterranean world, some staying only a season, others marrying, settling, and eventually being buried in this same ground. The necropolis itself sits where Apulum I's wealthy municipium once bordered Apulum II. the military settlement, civilian gold and imperial steel occupying the same stretch of riverbank. The graves cut into that ground hold a genuinely mixed material culture, local Dacian-style weapons resting beside distinctly Roman provincial burial customs. The two traditions folded into the same funerary ritual without apparent contradiction to the people performing it. The teeth researchers eventually extracted DNA from weren't chosen at random. Enamel survives 19 centuries of decay far better than bone, which is precisely why those small, unremarkable fragments ended up carrying this whole story. Somewhere in that ground lies a man who may have grown up speaking a Mediterranean dialect 1,000 miles from the Carpathians. Somewhere nearby lies a woman whose ancestors herded horses across steppe grassland generations before either of them was born. Neither life resembles the other. Both were buried under the same warrior symbolism, the same Draco standard, the same claim to belonging. The identity carved into that grave outlived the true story of the blood underneath it. And that's exactly the moment the twist arrives. Because everything you've just been told about why still isn't the full reveal. Here's the reveal, stated plainly. The DNA from Apulum Dialul Fursalor doesn't just complicate where these warriors came from. It exposes something bigger. That Dacian warrior was never a single bloodline. At any point in the timeline these researchers can actually see. Not before Rome, when the population was already a steppe Carpathian blend centuries in the making. Not after Rome, when a Mediterranean and North African signal layered on top of that older mixing, and possibly not even within individual graves, if the role-based recruitment reading holds any weight at all. Go back to that tidy national continuity story, the one built on pride, on a handful of surviving Dacian Thracian words, on the comforting idea of a single unbroken bloodline running from ancient warrior to modern descendant. The actual genome-wide data never confirms that a population like that ever existed in pure form. Not at the kingdom's height, not at its fall. The sex-biased split from earlier in this story and the pre-Roman steppe mixing that undercut Theory 1 aren't two separate anomalies. They're two layers of the exact same deeper pattern. Every generation studied added a new genetic layer onto the warrior. The one constant, the only thing that stayed fixed across centuries of shifting ancestry, was the burial rite itself. The weapons, the Draco symbolism, the ritual of being laid to rest as a fighter. Which means the contradiction planted at the very start of this story. A man buried under a fiercely native warrior identity, carrying DNA that points toward Anatolia and North Africa, was never a lab error, never contamination. It's the actual, statistically consistent pattern running through all 34 individuals recovered from this necropolis. Not one anomaly. A structure. Researchers still can't tell you, grave by grave, which specific individuals were foreign recruits absorbed into a warrior institution, which were steppe-descended locals whose ancestors never left the region, and which were the product of genuinely mixed, multi-generational families straddling both worlds. The study documents the pattern across the whole population. It can't yet, resolve a single life story within it. One researcher working adjacent to this kind of frontier genomics put it to a colleague in plainer terms during a recent conference discussion. You can sequence the bones, but you can't sequence the oath a man took to stand under that standard. That's not something DNA was ever built to hold. Which means the question this video opened with was always bigger than one skeleton. Because this pattern isn't unique to one riverside necropolis in Romania. Ancient DNA from Viking Age Scandinavia shows the same tension. A shared cultural and religious identity sitting on top of genetically diverse crews drawn from across northern Europe and beyond. Genomic studies of the Huns reveal similarly mixed ancestries unified less by bloodline than by shared military life. Even Rome's own legions, the very army that conquered Dacia, were filled with men from a dozen different ancestral backgrounds, bound together by oath and uniform rather than shared descent. Across every one of these warrior peoples, the genetic record keeps drawing the same line. Identity and ancestry are not the same thread, no matter how naturally people assume they must be. None of this makes modern pride in Dacian heritage foolish or misplaced. People who feel a real connection to this history aren't wrong to feel it, but the bones suggest that connection was always closer to a cultural inheritance, a story, a symbol, a name carried forward, than a single unbroken chain of blood. The mystery isn't solved by saying that. If anything, it's larger now than when this story began. There are more graves at Apulum still untested, more genomes still unsequenced, and no final answer yet on how many men buried under that Draco standard were born into the identity, and how many simply grew into it. Think of it less like a bloodline and more like a river that took on new water at every bend. Carpathian rain mixing with steppe snowmelt mixing, eventually, with tides that crossed the Mediterranean, until no single drop in it could honestly claim to be the source. Scientists scanned the Dacian warriors' bones expecting confirmation of a story 2,000 years old. What they found instead was a DNA secret that shocked everyone, and the river is still adding water.